Welcome, everybody. I'd like to introduce our veteran speakers that have addressed us, our keynote speakers, through the years. This isn't an easy job, and they all step forward willingly to do this. I want to once again thank you for joining us on this auspicious occasion. Veterans Day is a story of great people and their shining deeds, and not to forget the families' anxious vigils while their loved ones served. Surely, Veterans Day is an event of gratitude. Simply said, folks, this is our day. Let me now introduce Veterans Day speakers from the past. I believe their photographs are up on the screen. The late, great Captain Don Williams, a Vietnam veteran. He had 4 tours on the USS Enterprise, 33 airstrike medals, and 2 trips to the stars as an astronaut. Unfortunately, his widow is not here today. She fell ill, but she sends her greetings to everybody in the room. Next, we have Captain Bob Naughton. He was a shipmate of Don Williams. He spent 6 years in the Hanoi Hilton. Along with him, I have Admiral Bear Taylor. Bear, we call him Bear because he looks like a bear. Anyway, Bear Taylor Don Williams was Bear Taylor's wingman. Both of these veterans sent me an email and regretted that they could not join us today. I know a guy that is here today. That's First Lieutenant, United States Army Air Force, B-24 Bombardier during World War II, flying perilous missions in the Philippines. Bill Brew, please stand up. Thank you very much, Bill. Next, we have United States Force Master Chief Tom Hayden, a famed Cold War counterspy and Vietnam swift vote veteran. I'd like Tom and his lovely wife, Wendy, to please stand up, and let's give them a fine hand. Next, we have Rear Admiral Kathleen Dussault. She served 33 years, having a very storied career. She served in Iraq and Afghanistan as Director of Task Force 10. Kathleen and Ed, please stand. Ed is her husband. Finally, and he could not make it today, last year's speaker is First Lieutenant Carol Knudsen, a World War II B-17 co-pilot, shot down before his 21st birthday. He was interned in a POW camp in Poland, later Stalag Luft III in Germany. Let's give Harold a big hand, even though he isn't here. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. Beg your pardon, and he isn't here. Beg your pardon. Thank you, David. Close friend of mine, Liddell Nealon. He was a steward on a flotilla, a mine-sweeping flotilla. He was also on the invasion of the south of France and Normandy. Liddell has quite a unique story. He went into a post office in Glasgow, Mississippi, where a sign was, "Become Navy stewards and serve white officers." Liddell came forward. Long story short, he received a doctorate's degree. And what a fine gentleman. And again, his son came ill today, and he's unable to join us. Please give Liddell a big hand. In 1945, Harold Nabhan, a native of Pennsylvania, was selected as a candidate to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. These were heady days at the point, with the conclusion of World War II, the victory buoying everybody's spirit. The football team was led by All-Americans Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis, defeating the arch-rival Navy 4 years in a row, making the Corps of Cadets feel invisible. I'm sorry about that, Art. Anyway, I think some of you folks remember Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis. In 1950, Harold successfully graduated and was awarded gold bars as a newly minted Signal Corps second lieutenant. Shortly thereafter, the Korean War broke out. Many of his classmates had no idea where Korea was located. From here forward, I'm going to let Harold tell you in his own words his story about his service in Korea, which was termed the Forgotten War. Most importantly, he will share with you what it means to be an American and veteran in the service of our nation and honoring those that have gone before us. It is my distinct pleasure to know Harold and to have the honor of introducing this fine man as our Veterans Day keynote speaker. Navy veteran Sidney Ingram, front and center. Please escort our Veterans Day speaker, Harold Nabhan, to the lectern. Let's give Harold a fine hand, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Harold.
It has been said that freedom is not free, and yes, but it says freedom is now back in style. Good day and greetings to all veterans of America's wars, past and present, and to ladies and gentlemen here assembled. Today is the 14th Veterans Day celebration at Anthem, thanks to the untiring efforts of our own Art Lindbergh, Bill Campbell, and Steve McCarthy, along with the board of directors who over the past years have toiled to make today's celebration a success. On October 8, 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower officially changed the name of that hallowed day from Armistice Day to Veterans Day, in honor of veterans of all of America's wars and not just veterans of the Great War. My name is Harold Nabhan. I am proud and honored to speak to you on this glorious day. I pray that my presentation will be both informative and reminiscing. Every returning veteran from every war brings back a duffel bag full of war stories. Over the years, you have heard them all. Well, maybe not all of them. From brothers, sisters, fathers, sons, relatives, and friends. Some stories were riveting. Some were unbelievable. Some stories were entertaining, while too many, unfortunately, were tragic. But all were memorable. All were and are etched in the minds of every veteran forever. Today, please cast your minds back to times, places, and events that are long past. Remind your thoughts of the realization that those stories that you have heard time and again occurred to very young boys in their teens and 20s, stories that transformed millions of boys into men overnight. My story is that of millions of servicemen and women. My story is that of the Forgotten War, the Korean War, the police action, as President Harry S. Truman called it, a war in which this nation suffered 36,516,000 soldiers killed in action, but still a war that went undeclared by the Congress of the United States. And so here is my humble story. It was December of 1944. I was a very young teenager in Allentown, Pennsylvania. My brother Fred was a buck sergeant in the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment during the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium that was brought on by the German Ardennes offensive. We call it the Battle of the Bulge. That winter, he wrote to my dad and told him that I should soon be drafted into the Army and that I should volunteer for the service. He wrote also that he wanted me to go into the service as a commissioned officer. Well, when time came, I was pulled out of high school, sent off to a West Point preparatory school in Washington, D.C., after which I took the West Point validating exam. And before long, I found myself a plebe at the United States Military Academy at West Point, 60 miles up the river from New York City on the Hudson River. Our superintendent of cadets was Major General Maxwell D. Taylor, the same General Taylor who made a jump to be with his troops of the 101st Screaming Eagle Division during the British Market Garden Offensive in Belgium. And yes, the very same General Taylor who in 1964, as every Vietnam veteran knows, was the ambassador to Vietnam in Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City. Well, the cadet years flew by. Finally, on June 6, 1950, came graduation day. At the commencement ceremony, I dutifully threw my white garrison cap up into the air along with 600 other cadets. Months later, some kind person delivered that cap to my family on Union Boulevard in Allentown. It was an eventful graduation day. After graduation parade, I stood up for my classmate, George H. Hannon, an Army brat from Mobridge, South Dakota, who was wedded to his childhood sweetheart, Georgia Banks, also an Army brat, at the beautiful cadet chapel overlooking the plains of West Point below. Several of us made an archway with our sabers, as was a custom. Among the group were two Second Lieutenants Arthur N. Appman, Jr., from Ansonia, Connecticut, and Stanley P. Shankman from Brooklyn, New York. Arthur was a walrus, that is, a cadet who was unable to swim. That evening, I attended a formal reception with my dad. At the head of the reception line, we came upon four-star General J. Lawton Collins, the same J. Lawton Collins who commanded the U.S. Army 7th Corps during the Battle of the Bulge. My dad politely shook hands with General Collins. Then, bursting with pride, this immigrant who got off the boat at Ellis Island many years ago vigorously patted General Collins on the shoulder and explained, "My son Frederick was in your corps during the Battle of the Bulge." Well, I blanched. Expecting a look of disapprobation, instead, General Collins smiled broadly and said, "Please thank him for me." After the war, Fred went on by way of the GI Bill to become a trial attorney in the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. Anyway, now onto what I thought was going to be a much anticipated 60-day graduation furlough, but it was not to be. For 3 weeks later, on June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the President Kim Jong-un, the dictator of the People's Republic of North Korea, invaded the Republic of South Korea by crossing over the 38th parallel, which was an arbitrary line of demarcation placed there by Joseph Stalin and the Allied High Command forces at the end of the war. Well, in short order, I received that infamous telegram from the War Department with these terse words: "Report to Fort Lewis, Washington soonest." And so I did. 14 seasick days later, aboard the troop ship General Housey, which we called the Lousy Housey, we debarked at Yokohama, Japan, Japan's largest city, except that it was flattened and desolate. From Yokohama, we moved on to Tokyo, 18 miles away, and Tokyo was not much better after being firebombed by General Curtis LeMay's B-29 firebombing raids. Several days later, on September 15, 1950, we debarked at Busan, Korea, and on the same day, General Douglas MacArthur was making his famous but controversial invasion at Incheon, 200 miles northerly of Busan. The situation in Busan was chaotic. The city was being overrun by thousands of refugees pouring south, while troops, supplies, munitions, armaments, and materiel kept pouring in from the docks. The North Korean army, meanwhile, had closed in along the Nektong River Delta, creating what was known as the Busan Perimeter. Sparse elements of the 24th, 25th, and 1st Cavalry Division were fighting a desperate delaying action. We were told to get ready as it was appeared certain that Busan was going to get pushed back into the Sea of Japan. However, and meanwhile, General MacArthur at Incheon, with a detachment of the 1st Marine Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division, wasted no time in moving on to Yeongdongpo and then across the Han River on a hastily installed pontoon bridge into Seoul, a distance of about 30 miles. There they took on and defeated a large stand of North Koreans. General MacArthur's southerly charge, along with a breakout along the Nektong River, cut off and isolated the entire North Korean army, which literally disintegrated into isolated mobs of fleeing soldiers. After the breakout, our outfit advanced about 50 miles up through Daegu, a town with a paved street, and then proceeded another 75 miles into Daejeon. Daejeon is the infamous town where 2 months before, local South Korean military authorities had slaughtered between 4,000 and 7,000 suspected communist prisoners of war, men, women, and children. This was all prior to the occupation by the North Korean army. The slaughter was erroneously attributed to the North Koreans. We never knew the exact details, but wild stories told us by the survivors abounded of mass civilian massacres. This sordid episode was held secret by the South Korean government and by the United States government until 1999, when the Associated Press broke the declassified story and details of the massacre. On October 1st, 1950, General MacArthur ordered the United Nations troops to advance across the 38th parallel into North Korea, about 30 miles north of Seoul. Meanwhile, on that same day, our company commander received orders to send a detachment TDY to the 6th Rock Division, about 87 miles northeast of Seoul. The detachment was to be led by Captain Walt W. Bundy, coincidentally a veteran of my brother's regiment during the war. I requested appointment as second in command, but the response from my company commander, Captain Harold E. Earl, an old soldier from the 1936 Panama operation, was short, succinct, and ever etched into my memory. Nabhan, he retorted, "I wouldn't trust you to carry the mail across the street." So off went the detachment into eternity with Second Lieutenant George Hannon, 4 years at West Point, 4 months as second lieutenant, and 17 days in Korea in my stead. The dual DSC citations stated that Captain Walt W. Bundy and Second Lieutenant George E. Hannon distinguished themselves by extraordinary heroism in action against enemy aggressor forces near Wanju on 2 October 1950. At 0100 hours, their bivouac area was attacked by a banzai charge of enemy troops. Their compound was subjected to heavy direct fire. The enemy troops then launched a frontal assault, and utterly disregarding their own safety while in an exposed position, they covered the escape of the detachment. Captain Bundy and Lieutenant Hannon maintained their position, although severely wounded, until ultimately the enemy troops overran their position. The supreme act of heroism, as we all know, is where one soldier or citizen gives up his or her life, not only that others might live, but also to help perpetuate the principle of freedom and liberty for all of mankind. Patriotism, American style, is not a new phenomenon. On July 2nd, 1776, the United States Congress ratified the Declaration of Independence. 1 month later, on August 2nd, 1776, 56 members signed the Declaration, knowing full well that if the revolution failed, their lives would be sacrificed to the British as traitors to the British Crown. That, ladies and gentlemen, is patriotism, American style. The U.S. 8th Army route continued northward. By late October, we were in the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, and moving fast. I spent a night holed up in the Imperial Palace in complete darkness all night long with my eyes wide open. On one occasion, on the way up, that was our expression, retreating and you were on the way down. I was on lonely duty in the mountains northeast of Pyongyang when I came across a British Army patrol. The officer invited me into a cave for a spot of tea. So there I was in the middle of nowhere, sitting on a makeshift stool, having my afternoon tea. Now, a word about bivouac areas. Choosing a nightly bivouac area required some thought. A field of view, level terrain along a main road were important. But the most important criterion was to find an area strewn with garbage, debris, and detritus from prior bivouacs, whether from friend or foe, really no matter. Old clothes, tin cans, broken equipment, old shoes, all spelled a safe bivouac area. Now, on the other hand, a level line of sight, virgin area with soft vegetation, clean, untouched, and inviting ground with good approaches was sheer poison. Very likely an area such as that was a sleeping minefield laid by KPA forces who were very adept at laying minefields into strategic locations. By October 19th, incredibly, we had advanced well beyond Pyongyang, moving on to Sinanju, Anju, and the road towards Sinuiju, where the North Korean Army headquarters was located 50 miles northerly from Pyongyang, close by the banks of the Yalu River, which separated Manchuria from North Korea. Meanwhile, the appearance of the bivouac areas had changed dramatically. The garbage and debris looked unfamiliar. The abandoned clothing had changed. It was quilted. 8th Army kept denying that there were Chinese on the Korean peninsula, but I think we knew better. The Chinese were there, hidden somewhere in the mountains. We knew we were where we should not be, but our orders were to just keep moving. And then it happened with sudden swiftness. That same day, October 19th, the Chinese army secretly poured across the Yalu River by, it was estimated, the hundreds of thousands, completely overwhelming the UN forces by October 25th. Suddenly, there was a sustained, mysterious pause, a lull and silence from the Chinese which lasted several weeks. During this quiescent period, the UN forces regrouped, and General MacArthur, emboldened on November 24th, announced the Home by Christmas offensive. The word spread like wildfire through 8th Army. I was in Sananju when I heard it, and all I could say was, yeah, right, sure. The very next day, the Chinese attacked in full force. The Great Retreat was on. The U.S. 2nd Division and the UN Turkish Brigade conducted a wrenching 2-day holding rearguard action near Kunari while suffering heavy casualties. The retreat was shameless, but necessary. On foot, I will never forget the narrow dirt road, choked with dust, troops of all nations, refugees on foot, on cattle carts, kimchi buckets, bicycles, 6-bys, anything, all in one wild pell-mell rush south. A Turkish brigade truck came into sight, and I waved my arms frantically. I was shouting, "Marhaba, marhaba." Hearing that, the driver slowed down, picked me up on board with a truck full of Turkish troops. Marhaba meaning hello in Turkish. I do not know how many days passed or how I got there, but about 250 miles later, well below Tegu, I fell in with other beleaguered troopers. I am quick to retort that to survive, the U.S. 8th Army headquarters had no choice but to order a complete, uncontrolled, gigantic mass retrograde movement. For to do otherwise or to make a disorderly, uncoordinated stand against overwhelming Chinese odds would have resulted in an unnecessary debacle of the highest order. I do not believe, notwithstanding the longest retreat in U.S. military history, that this movement brought any disgrace to the United States Army. The U.S. 8th Army had lived to fight another day. On December 27th, I was promoted to first lieutenant. In early January of 1952, the Chinese Army retook Seoul after a bitter UN forces holding action. And on April, General Ridgway retook Seoul now for about the third time. The battle raged back and forth and ultimately settled in along the 38th parallel. Late in the spring of 1951, I was sent TDY with the Regimental Combat Team, whose designation I do not remember, but it was an unforgettable experience. The line was fluid, the troopers were wild, young, crazy, afraid of no one and afraid of nothing. These were American soldiers. And I will say this, I do not believe that patriotism was in their lexicon. It was just in their being. While there, they were given a line sector to hold, and they held, odds notwithstanding, and Seoul was retaken again, as I had mentioned. Patriotism, as we know it, for those troopers would come later in life with flags, bunting, speeches, and thanksgivings. Seems to me that patriotism is a subjective inner feeling, germane to all Americans in and out of service. Patriotism is manifested in different ways, remembrances, giving thanks, gratitudes, and yes, in doing it and feeling good about our great country. Shortly after that TDY, I was sent on R&R to Kyoto, Japan, the ancient and religious capital of Japan, or as we affectionately called it, I&I. On April 11th, 1951, President Harry S. Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur. And everyone knows the saga of President Truman and General MacArthur. The war had become political. General MacArthur wanted to invade and to bomb Manchuria and possibly use what was then called the atomic bomb. President Truman was outraged that General MacArthur was making political military decisions. The Joint Chiefs of Staff backed President Truman, fearing that an impossible all-out land war with the Chinese would break out. Nevertheless, there was not one American soldier who did not want to storm across that Yalu River into Manchuria. But a land war on Chinese soil would have been an unmitigated disaster. Probably because neither side made a serious effort at this time, the Chinese couldn't, and the 8th Army that could, wouldn't. Peace talks were in the wind, and the American Eighth Army, then referred to as the UN forces, wisely chose not to commence a sustained land war with the Chinese. The Chinese army had stretched its lines of supply to the breaking point and was short on ammunition, food, supplies, transportation, equipment, and was suffering from very low morale, while the U.S. Eighth Army gained steadily in strength, equipment, and with morale. On August 31st, 1951, my classmate Arthur Appman, the Walrus, of whom I have spoken, was on a ponton bridge on the raging Goyang River near Chuncheon, South Korea, in attempting to maintain the integrity of the pontons. Lieutenant Abman was flung overboard and ultimately swallowed by the raging torrent. He gave his life so that others might live. Someone once said the foundation of freedom is the courage of ordinary people. Through the fall and winter of 1951 and 1952, large troop movements were curtailed. I was back in the Uijeongbu region, northeast of Seoul, near the 38th parallel, and had never heard of Panmunjom. Now, a word about gear. The winter of 1950-1951 was frigid. Our equipage was World War II vintage. Our combat boots were worthless, fashionable, leather, double-strap types that froze our feet. Our jackets were the World War II standard garrison jackets with fatigue caps, helmet liners, and steel helmets. Enlisted personnel carried the ever-faithful World War II M1 30 caliber Garand semi-automatic 8-round clip rifle, while officers carried the famous Colt 1911 semi-automatic pistol 7-round clip, plus the baby 30 caliber semi-automatic M1 carbine with the 15-round clip or the 30-round banana clip. An innovator would take 3 banana clips, take them together in an appropriate fashion, and he had a 90-round sustained fire weapon. However, he probably would melt down the barrel to boot if he ever tried it. The .45 that I carried in Korea was that same .45 that my brother Fred carried during the war. It is my most cherished possession. Clothing-wise, the winter of 1951-52 was more fitting. We were issued gloves, all-weather boots with thick felt pads, fur-lined parkas with hoods, the famous Korean cap with earmuffs that tied under your chin, and we had sleeping bags. In January of 1952, my company mate, Lieutenant Stanley P. Shankman, of whom I spoke earlier, upon news from the Red Cross, was sent home on emergency leave. Incredulously, fate struck again. On January 19th, 1952, his C-54 crashed into the Pacific Ocean. All aboard perished. By the summer of 1952, rumors were again rampant about imminent peace talks. But for me, great day, rotation time suddenly arrived. Individual soldiers left on rotation, and individual soldiers came as replacements, and not as by units as in World War II. I debarked Korea across the now familiar Han River Ponton Bridge through Yeongdong-po to Incheon, Yeongdong-po, where at an earlier time my troops emptied the gasoline from their jerry cans and filled them with beer from the Yeongdong-po brewery. At Incheon, I boarded an LCI and then transferred to a troop ship nearly 2 years after General MacArthur's famous landing. I was not a trencher. I was a regular GI in the 51st Signal Battalion I Corps, one of hundreds of thousands who did his duty. I saw it all. I lived a never-forgotten lifetime in the land of the morning calm. My Army service record indicated that I was awarded 7 Bronze Battle Stars, but not to be confused with the Bronze Star for Valor, to which my brother Fred was awarded for heroism in Belgium. This time on the voyage stateside, I was billeted in a stateroom above deck. I do not remember the name of the troop ship, but I debarked at Seattle amid flags flying, banners waving, water cannons spraying, bands blaring, and throngs of people cheering. We were given immediate home leave. My great adventure was complete. On my arrival home at the AB airport in Allentown, my mother fell down upon her knees and gave thanks to God that her second son came home safely from the war. I want to thank you all. May God bless us all, everyone, and may God bless America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Thank you.
Art, we have to get some flowers here.